The HR Stories podcast is brought to you by the team at HR Stories. The team at HR Stories helps anyone with HR responsibilities be better at managing the employee experience. To engage with us, go to the hrstoriesteam.com and learn more about how we can support your business or nonprofit. Have you ever wondered why a company would do something so stupid that would cost them their brand reputation, hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines, and some of their best employees? Each week, management and HR consultant John Tallheimer and Chuck Simikian dive into the stories that matter and discuss the lessons and what we should do to protect our organizations. Welcome to the HR Stories podcast, where there is a lesson in every story. On this week's episode, John and Chuck talk about discipline in the workplace and why it's important to do it properly. But first, here is what's happening in the human resources news. All right, Chuck, welcome. How are you doing this week?
Yeah, I'm doing well. I'm feeling great. I get excited about this portion of our HR Stories podcast every week. I get excited about all of our stories, but there's so much HR news, and I really love bringing it forward, just picking some really cool stories that are news items that could be potential stories. So I know you and I have a couple of news picks for the week. You want to go first, or you want me to go first? What do you got?
I'll go first. I go first. So I was skimming through, and I was looking at Vice, which is a news story, and the headline read this: CEO celebrates worker who sold family dog after he demanded they return to the office. And so ClearLink CEO James Clark, in a bizarre video, as it were, called in a call-in in which he expressed skepticism of his own employees' motives and capacity to juggle work and parenthood. And so basically what happened was on April 3rd, he did a town hall with all his employees, a virtual town hall, and said, look, if you live within 50 miles of our company headquarters, you need to come into the work 4 days a week. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, right? Because we're hearing a lot of people doing this and a lot of companies going, okay, you need to come back in. You need to come back in. I don't think he did it well. Like just reading the article and watching the speech, I don't think he did it well. And the worst part of was as early as or as late as like last month, or well, for sure, October, he says, we have no plans to mandate in-office work. And so he went through that whole thing like, hey, no, we're not going to do it. We're not going to do it. And then suddenly everything changed for him, or, circumstances changes. And now he's like, yep, we need people to be back in the work office. So I don't know, Chuck, I know that's happening a lot. What are your thoughts? What are you thinking about that?
Well, sure. If I understand what you're saying is the owner or the CEO, wherever, points to this person and says, look how committed they are. Look what a great employee they are. Correct? And they sold their dog. That's right. Well, I'll be. So, Go ahead.
I think there's a lot. We're hearing a lot of this about you need to return to the office. Everyone needs to be back returning to the office. And I just don't know. Let me tell you, I got to tell you this other story. So I was talking to one of my friends, and he was telling me that they have a requirement for them to be in the office 3 days a week. And the requirement is this: they need to go in, go through the turnstiles as they go into the building, go to their desk and punch in. Right? That's the requirement. That's how they gauge whether people are in the office or not. And he literally had his conversation with his boss, and his boss was like, as long as you're punched in, go home. Like there's no out punch, nothing at the end of the day, right? And so they're using this metric of people being in the office when they're not really in the office. And so I just think that this idea of returning from home or returning to the workforce needs to be done in a manner that is respectful to your employees. Mm-hmm. The other thing he said, and I don't know if you caught it in the headline, but he said that CEO ClearLink said, well, it's only for employees that live within 50 miles of their headquarters.
Ah, okay, right.
Right? So if I'm a remote worker, I don't have to go in. It's not important for me to be there, but it's important if I live within 25 miles. And in the messaging, it said, look, you're not going to, if you live within 50 miles, you can't move outside of that 50 miles, right? And so just the messaging is wrong. And I think CEOs are getting frustrated, right? They don't see the productivity. They're concerned that their company's not doing well, and they're trying to do anything to get better. But I think there's a method. There has to be a process to do that. And so if you're thinking about, listeners, if you're thinking about, okay, we want to bring people back into work, you need to really think about what the goal is, and why that is out there.
Yeah. I have heard, and I've been reading a lot about this, and every day there's a story about a company that says you were demanding you come back to work and things like that. And so some of the general thoughts, as people have given some thought into this as to why that is, I've read where there's the boss theory, right? So remote work is calling into question the purpose of the boss. The boss model is to make sure employees get work done. And so those employees have to be in front of them so the bosses can ensure they're working. And it's almost like, if I don't see you working, then I don't have anything to do. So as a boss, what's my purpose? And if you'll notice, the thought leadership on that is the term boss, not leader, and not leadership. And that's where I think the divergence is going. As enlightened as we try and become as maybe a society and a work environment and that sort of thing, there is still that boss mentality that can't let go of what's my purpose other than to make sure you do your job. Therefore, I need to see you doing it.
Right. The only way I can tell you're doing your job is by seeing you in the seat, right? And it frustrates me. And so there are some statistics out there. We do know that productivity went up when people started to work from home. Productivity went up. We also know that collaboration went down, right? And so I think there has to be a hybrid approach where you're increasing your collaboration, but can you do that online, right? And so I think about, and this is going to be a weird example, Chuck, but I think about those individuals that play video games online with people across the country or across the world. And they're very collaborative. They're working together. They're doing that kind of stuff. And suddenly we're asking them now to be in a workplace and try to be collaborative when they're already knowing how to be collaborative wherever they are. And so I think it may be generational. I'm not going to say it there, but maybe it's generational. But I do think, I love your boss. Hey, boss, I need you in the seat doing that kind of stuff. I think that's a challenge as well, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Remote work is a new model for managers. It's a reckoning for bosses. So There we go. Drop the mic. Yeah. Boom. Yeah. See you next week, folks.
Yeah, that's it. We're out of here. No, and I agree with that. And I think as a manager, I have always been about the results, not, they punched in and punched out, right? Or are they getting the results I need? Now, sometimes that's going to take 60 hours in a week. Sometimes that'll take 40. Sometimes it'll take 30. But if they're getting that work done, there. Now, I just want to be clear, because there are some companies out there that can't do work from home, right? They're just because of that job, right? And so we have to be aware of that. And so not every job can be work from home at this point, right? With things coming down, who knows? Maybe,
Absolutely.
We'll have people working from home there. All right. So what other stories we got, Chuck? What else has been in the news?
Well, I got a couple of news stories that I'm just going to tease out, because these in themselves could be full HR Stories podcasts. But one of the things that came out yesterday, technically, it was today, this morning. It was a Third Circuit Court, which I understand comes out of that Michigan area, perhaps. So it's north, maybe Midwest area, Third Circuit. And they said PTO is not part of salary under FLSA, which I know a lot of companies kind of know that if you take PTO, it doesn't go towards overtime or anything like that. But that's not where this story is going. This story involves a nursing group that in order to accrue PTO, you had to do what they call productivity points. So instead of granting you, let's say, you get 5 hours of PTO a month or 40 hours a year or 80 hours a year, they wouldn't do it that way. You would have to do certain things and you would get what they call productivity points. Those productivity points went towards you're saying, okay, you have so many productivity points, you get PTO. So I might have 37 hours in my bank, but if I don't hit my productivity for the week, then what the company was doing was they were taking PTO out. So all of a sudden, I don't hit productivity this week. I go from 37 hours to 35 hours. And I'm thinking, what the heck? And then the next week, I don't hit productivity. I go from 35 to maybe 34 or 33. So the lawsuit said, wait, you can't do that. But the courts came back and said, yes, you can.
Yeah, it's an interesting model, right? Because now you're rewarding people for being productive with time off, which is interesting, right? That's a reward. We're going to give you time off. You've been really productive. We're going to give you time off. I do think that goes against the research that says people need time off to be productive, right? And so if they're not meeting their productive levels and they're going into negative and they can't get that time off, then that's just going to stress them out and they're going to be less and less productive over time. But it's interesting. I mean, I agree with the court. I think the court made the right decision. I just don't know culturally if that's the best way to deal with that. But I do kind of like it versus, well, you've been here for 22 years and you get 6 weeks of vacation. Right?
Yeah. And there's so much more to this story. And I would love to bring it forward as a full HR story.
Okay.
And,
yeah.
But what else, what do you have, John?
Well, the other thing, so, we do classes, right? We do workshops. And I was doing a workshop yesterday and we were doing it on payroll law, right? We were diving into payroll law and all the intricacies of payroll law. Fascinating class, a lot of great, smart people in the class and lots of conversations with that class. And so we're about halfway through the class and somebody asked me this question and I want to ask it of you, Chuck, because I wasn't 100% sure, it came up and I started doubting myself. And so I want to make sure that I did do it, that answered the right way. And so let's say you have an employee, right? Typically works Monday through Friday, 40 hours a work week, non-exempt employee, works 40 hours a work week. And so on Thursday, company they need to work an additional 4 hours of time, right? Okay. So normally they're working 8, they ended up working 12 hours on that day. Well, the next day, Friday, they call out sick. Would those 4 hours be overtime?
Yeah.
That's the question.
Yeah means I understand the question.
I got you.
No, well, as we always say in HR, it depends. Depends on what state you're in. Right off the bat, I'm going to say if you're in California, yes, more than 8 hours worked in a day, you're definitely getting the overtime. It depends on what your company policies are. Most company policies will say things like PTO, vacation, sick pay, bereavement, jury duty are not considered for purposes of overtime. And it's very simple why there's the legal premise on that. The legal premise is work suffered or permitted. And so being sick, you're not doing work for the company. You're not suffering any work. So therefore, that's the legal cornerstone for that. Some companies, John, might decide they want to include that. I've never run into anyone. And that's why it's a good idea in your policies to say certain categories of hours. And I just went through them again: PTO, vacation, maybe jury, bereavement, that sort of thing. Do not accrue as overtime or do not fall into the overtime equation.
Right. They're not hours worked, right?
They're not hours worked.
Right? Suffered or permitted to work. Good. I got the answer right, which is always a good thing when you're standing up in front of the people. But I think it's an important thing. And I think what you go to, Chuck, is what does your policy say? Now, your policy can't be against the law, right? You can't be like, well, in California, my policy says that after you don't get out overtime, you'd get in trouble for that. But when you clearly there's not direction or you're not getting information, it's always good to clearly state out so the employees know, hey, if you do not work more than 40 hours in the work week, you're not going to get overtime, right? And so making sure they know that and clearly saying, this is hours worked, this isn't hours worked, this is still time, you're still going to get paid for that, but you're going to get paid at your standard rate. So that's good. Great.
Absolutely.
Any other stories that are kind of pulling at you, Chuck, before we get into the big story of the day?
Sure. Just a couple of news headlines that came across my desk. One was EEOC issues promising practices for preventing and addressing harassment in the federal sector. So what that is, that's a technical assistance document that the EEOC is publishing out there. It's kind of a position. And when they publish these positions, it's kind of like the foreshadowing of additional enforcement. John, you ever drive down the road and they have those automated signs that say your speed? It's like flashing. It's maybe the police department puts it out there and you're going faster and it flashes at you, kind of a warning. Well, most of the time that precedes in another week or so, a police officer with radar is going to be sitting there. So you got your fair warning. And now we're going to tag you. So this is the technical document. It's called Promising Practices for Preventing Harassment in the Federal Sector, which provides practical tips for preventing and addressing harassment within the federal civilian workforce. So for any of our federales out there that work for the federal government, guess what? It's coming. Something is coming. Something's on the horizon. Make sure all of your sexual harassment prevention techniques, classes, everything is in place because there's additional enforcement coming. I feel it.
Yeah. All right. Good. All right. Well, I think we should probably take our break now before I get into my big story. I don't know. Should I tease the story before the
Tease
break?
it, John. Tease it.
All right. So we're going to be talking about discipline in the workplace, particularly around dress codes and how we need to be consistent.
I love it. You have been listening to the HR Stories podcast, where there's a lesson in every story. We will be back right after this break. Hello, listeners. I have some questions for you. Do you find yourself struggling with HR and employment issues? Are you afraid you could make the wrong employment decision that will cost your company thousands or even millions of dollars? Maybe you're new to the world of HR, or you've been in HR for a while and you just wish you had one resource, a guide to help you get HR right. Well, I've got good news for you. The team at HR Stories is excited to announce a new comprehensive resource, the Ultimate Book of HR Checklists. We created the Ultimate Book of HR Checklists as a simple step-by-step resource guide packed with 70 downloadable checklists and other resources that help small businesses and organizations get human resources right. Even with very little HR or management experience, you can get instant results with concise, practical steps for addressing many of your tough employment issues. Do not miss out. Go to hrchecklist.com to learn more. That's hrchecklists with an S.com to learn more. And as always, thanks for listening to the HR Stories podcast, where the lesson is always in the story. You've been listening to the HR Stories podcast, where there's a lesson in every story. And you've been listening to HR in the news, but now it's time to get to the main drumroll stories. John, What's our
the
story
main event.
today? You teased about it.
I teased about it, right? Yeah. So I'm going to start with some questions for our listeners. Let me ask you some questions, listeners. Do you consistently enforce your dress code policies? If an employee violates it, how do you respond? So this is a story, right? So this is a story we're going to be talking about. In the summer of 2020, Whole Foods, Amazon's upscale grocery store, dress code policy and its subsequent discipline was called into question by its workers. For years before the summer of 2020, Whole Foods stores had a dress code prohibiting employees from wearing clothing with any visible slogan, message, logo, advertising, unless it was branded with Whole Foods logo or an affiliate, right? So it could be an affiliate there. But it was seldomly enforced, Chuck. On April 13th, 2020, Whole Foods required all employees to wear a face mask at work due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Can you believe it's been 3 years since the start of the pandemic? That's a kind of aside. We were going through pictures from 3 years ago, and my wife and I were out at a walk. We went out for a walk, and I was like, we probably just needed to get out of the house, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. All right. So on April 13th, Whole Foods put this in place. They did it, but again, it was seldomly enforced. So the protagonist of our story is Haley Evans. She started working for Whole Foods in April of 2017, where she worked in a variety of departments. She returned to Whole Foods after an unrelated absence in the summer of 2020 after the mask mandate had been issued. On June 22nd, 2020, Evans wore a Black Lives Matter mask in support of the Black community in wake of the murder of George Floyd by the Minnesota police, and, this is important, to speak out against racism at Whole Foods, which she had personally experienced. When she was working in the bakery section of Whole Foods, she actually accidentally burned some rolls. Another retail worker came into the kitchen and said, "Those rolls are darker than you."
Oh, geez. We talked about this in our last week's previous episode when joking around work is no laughing matter. And people still say things they think is funny, they're insensitive, they're stupid, and it's just, I don't know what the word would be, but uncalled for. Folks, take a listen to that episode.
Yeah, definitely dive into that episode. Sometimes a joke, you may think it's a joke, but it could be offensive to somebody else. So this so-called joke was reported to her supervisor. She reported it up to her supervisor, who disciplined the employee who had said it. So took care of it, disciplined it. However, that wasn't the end of the racist remarks. Evans and numerous coworkers stated that other employees had used racial slurs around them, but never reported it to management.
It surprises me as you tell me this story from Whole Foods. I've always seen Whole Foods or understood Whole Foods as a kind of a love all, serve all, hey, inclusive-y type of environment. We don't, and so to hear this is, I shouldn't use the word shocking because nothing shocks me anymore. There's all kind of crazy stuff out there, but I'm surprised culturally from Whole Foods on this.
I'm surprised culturally too. It does sound that they do deal with it in the workplace. So it's not like, oh yeah. And so I do think if it had been addressed, that probably would have been taken care of, but maybe not, right? And again, Whole Foods is a big chain, right? There's a lot of different Whole Foods, and every store will have their own type of work environment or work culture. So obviously, it's hard to address all those, but that's where that general manager comes in there. All right.
Okay.
So now back to our story. When Evans arrived with the Black Lives Matter mask, she was told by the store lead that the mask was not permitted under the dress code policy. She either had to use another mask or leave. Evans decided to leave. Now, let me go back. I just want to read the policy again, just so we get it in there. So the Whole Foods policy, whether it's the dress code policy, right, whether that's a mask or a shirt or a pair of pants or shoes, any visible slogan, message, or logo or advertising, unless it was branded with Whole Foods logo, was not acceptable, right? And so it was not acceptable. And so they were enforcing that policy. Now, at the same time, the Mid-Atlantic region of Whole Foods, so going back to that, there are numerous different regions. And when I read this article, what I found interesting is that each region has different types of policies. Based on that region, I guess based on the culture. I don't know, it was kind of weird that they would have different things. And so what was interesting in the Mid-Atlantic region, and this is going to come into our story a little bit later, they had an attendance policy that defined absence as any time you are scheduled to work and do not report to work or do not complete your shift, you would be considered absence.
Mm-hmm.
So you would be then subject to corrective action if they had 12 full or partial absent days, or more than 10 absences in any 12-month period, or three, this is the important one, 3 separate absences in 30-day period, or 5 separate absences in the 6-month period, right? Okay. So after Evans decides to leave, she was interviewed by a reporter. So we don't know if that was set up or whatever, but she was interviewed by a reporter and told the reporter that she was being sent home for wearing a Black Lives Matter mask, and also recounted her prior interaction with a coworker. Well, of course, right? And so anytime your company is out in the news, you get the alerts. And so that interview went up to, I think all the way up to the vice president. People had seen it in there. The next day, she called out from work, but decided to come into the workplace to talk to the general manager, who reiterated that she could not wear a mask with a Black Lives Matter written across it, that it was against company policy. On her next 4 scheduled shifts, she worked until a manager or supervisor asked her to change her mask, and when she refused, she was sent home. Evans and the store team lead had a conversation where the team lead encouraged her to come back to work. They wanted her to work, but they said, you can't wear the Black Lives Matter. It's against company policy. Also stated that during this conversation that she was in violation of the company's attendance policy.
Okay.
Right? So Evans returned to work on her next shift, where the store lead provided her a written warning for being absent more than 3 separate occasions within a 30-day period, right? Which is against the Mid-Atlantic Whole Foods absence policy. Evans then files a complaint with the EEOC for racial discrimination based on the fact that she wasn't allowed to wear the Black Lives Matter mask, why in the past other employees had been able to wear clothing with brand names, slogans, etc. On July 25th, she was giving her final written warning. August 1st, she was terminated. She and other plaintiffs sued Whole Foods for discrimination based on their policy of not letting them wear Black Lives Matter. And so just so we know, right, under the law, the plaintiff bears the burden of proffering evidence sufficient to establish a prima facie case. Number 1, a plaintiff must show that she undertook protected conduct. Number 2, suffered an adverse employment action. And the 2 were casually linked.
Okay, can I just ask you, she was written up, the attendance, so are they including the fact that she was sent home as part of her attendance infractions? Oh, my goodness. So they sent her home because of the mask, and they said, we're including this as an attendance infraction. And the reason you're getting this infraction is because of this mask. It's because, and a number of other things, which dovetailed to an EEOC complaint on racial discrimination. Wow. Okay. It's interesting how things connect like that.
Yeah. So the policy was that if you left for any reason, you did not complete your shift, you were written up, you were absent. Right. And so you were required to complete your shift. Otherwise, you were absent. And that's the policy in the handbook. So good. So in this case, Whole Foods argues that the plaintiffs could not have a good faith, reasonable belief that the enforcement of the dress code was against the wearing of Black Lives Matter mask was discriminatory, as it was enforced against all employees regardless of their race. And so what happened was the Whole Foods was saying, look, we have enforced this policy. It didn't matter if you were wearing a Nike logo, Black Lives Matter, anything. We would say, no, you cannot wear that. Now, the challenge they had in court was that up until the summer of 2020, that dress code was loosely enforced, right? And so it wasn't consistently enforced. And some people would be like, yeah, you can't wear that. But no, some managers would, some leads would, but it wasn't consistently enforced. But as of, I forget what the date was, but like somewhere in June or May of that year, a company edict came down saying, you need to make sure you enforce the dress code policy. So those stores in the mid-Atlantic regions were really enforcing that policy.
Yeah.
And so anybody that crossed that line was being sent home or being told, if it was a mask, told to wear another mask. If it was a shirt, they had to put on another shirt and that kind of stuff. So basically, Whole Foods argued and ended up winning, saying they were consistently enforcing their dress code policy across the board, prohibiting employees from wearing clothing with any visible signs, message, logo, or advertising unless it was branded with the Whole Foods logo or affiliate.
Okay. All right. Well, that is the key. The key is in what you just said, but let's take a quick break and talk about how we can enforce and uphold our policies without discriminatory behavior so that it does not get to this point of an EEOC complaint, court costs, and a downturn in employee morale. Folks, you've been listening to the HR Stories podcast, where there is a lesson in every story.
Harassment at work continues to be a major issue. But do you know what to do when one of your employees tells you they have been harassed at work? The team at HR Stories is presenting a half-day workshop called Investigating Harassment Complaints. Registration information is in the show notes, or you can go to hrchecklist.com and register for our newsletter. Welcome back, everyone. Chuck and I have been talking about discipline and discrimination in the workplace. And Chuck, it sounds like you have some examples of how you dealt with dress codes when you were director of HR. How did you kind of deal with those kind of things?
Yeah. So as I shared on our break, we would deal with dress codes because we had uniforms. So a lot of times in the hospitality or theme industry, everyone would have a uniform or a dress code. And so if we were going to do anything different, we might say, all right, a memo saying during the next 30 days, you're allowed to do this or you're allowed to do that. Sometimes during, for example, Valentine's Day, or sometimes during the holidays, we might allow certain things. We might say non-religious symbols. I don't know. I mean, it gets very dicey when you start saying these things. So you'd have to say, if you want to wear a heart or you want to wear this or that. But I will tell you, John, the key is the consistency. Because if you do allow your employees to start wearing, let's say, non-work related items, or in this case, masks, and we would say you can have black masks, white masks, no logos, no wording. We might say, if you do, it's going to have to be the company issued one that says Marriott or Hilton or something on it. But once you start allowing people to go outside of that and you're not consistent, then you can't bring that back in. And I'll give you a very specific example is for unions, right? So if you allow people to wear pins based on anything other than what you're allowing, then if there's a union drive and some of your employees are wearing pins saying, join the union, that sort of thing, you can't tell them you can't wear that union organizing pin because that's a labor relations NLRB violation. So if you allow one, you have to allow all. And the same premise is with bulletin boards too. A lot of companies have these bulletin boards up, and employees, well, I want to put my Girl Scout cookie thing up there, and I want to put my join this club, and I want to put, and when you start allowing those things, you have to allow other things, including, and I know we've talked about unions a little bit, and we're going to talk about it in a couple of weeks again, but including, hey, join this union, come to this. So it gets very dicey. The key is having a policy and consistently enforcing it.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think you just ended the episode right there. I think those are the two words that we have. I like, hey, we're done. I'm done. That's good. It's fantastic. All right. No, seriously though, So let's dive into this a little bit deeper. Let's go into this a
Sure.
little bit deeper. What can we do as businesses, as employers, as HR professionals to reduce the risk when it comes to disciplining our employees so we don't fall into that category of, oh, you're discriminatory against me because of my race, my religion, my national origin, my gender identity, whatever, getting in there, right? And so typically businesses have a right to discipline employees, including termination, as long as you, as the company, adheres to labor and anti-discrimination laws. In all states except for Montana, right, we talk about employment at will exists, right? So meaning we can terminate an employee at any time for any reason, no reason at all, with or without notice, as long as we do it legally.
Mm-hmm.
So here's my 5 things that we should do to reduce risk. And Chuck, I would love for you to add as we go along. Number 1, have a consistent way to follow employment law. We do recommend using the Ultimate Book of HR Checklist. There is some great tips and tricks in there that you can use to kind of keep your consistency going. Review your policies and procedures to make sure they are not discriminatory or the decisions you're making are not based on the protected classes, race, color, religion, sex, including pregnancy, sexual orientation, and gender identity, national origin, disability, age, 40 or over, or genetic information, including family medical history. There was a policy this company had in place during COVID is they demanded from employees the status of their family members for vaccinations.
Mm-hmm.
And the company got sued because that was against the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, better known as GINA, and they lost. And they didn't know, it wasn't like the company was not being intentional about this,
Right.
Completely unintentional. As soon as they found out, they said, oh my goodness, we didn't know. They stopped doing it. They were just trying to protect all their workers, right? And so that's the way they thought about doing it. So sometimes we make mistakes by not knowing or having an HR consultant around. Number 3, ensure that any discipline is consistent with your policies and that you can justify treating any employee differently, right? And so, yes, you want to be as consistent, but there are times that sometimes we need to do something different based on maybe the ADA, based on FMLA, any of those things. And so you need to be able to justify that. Why are we treating that individual there? Communicate, right, clearly with the employee on why the discipline is taking place. Do not leave any room for doubt. So it sounds like Whole Foods did a really clear job communicating with Haley Evans that, hey, the reason we're asking you not to wear a Black Lives Matter has to do completely with our dress codes. We are not against Black Lives Matter. We're not, we understand that's a major issue and it definitely needs to be addressed. But in this case, we have a dress code policy and you are breaking that dress code policy, right? Mm-hmm. So again, doing that really clearly is important. And then capturing performance through clear and concise documentation, right? So if you are making these decisions, and in this case, if Haley is breaking the policy, the dress code policy, and then therefore the attendance policy, right? Because she had a choice, she chose to leave. You're clearly writing all of that down. You have that there. Because if you show up in court like Whole Foods do, and you don't have any documentation, what's going to happen, Chuck? No documentation.
Yeah, you will not succeed in court. Documentation is the I call it the sweet nectar of employee litigation defense.
Yeah, I love that. So the biggest challenge the team at HR Stories sees is that the management team is not closely aligned with the HR team or following employment law. Right. And so we talk to HR managers all the time and we hear them say, well, the managers aren't following this. They're not doing this and they're not following this. I will tell you, when I go into an organization and I hear this phrase, I know there's a problem between management and HR. And here's the phrase. Oh, that's an HR thing.
Oh.
Yeah. Right. Because as soon as I hear that, I know that managers or supervisors are going, oh, well, HR is just putting things in place just because they think it's necessary. And that's never, HR is never doing that, right? HR is doing that to protect our organizations. And we're putting things in place to protect organizations, making sure we do that. So we highly recommend that organizations take the time to train your management team on policies and procedures to protect your organization. It's actually one of our favorite courses to teach. Because we see the light bulbs go off like halfway through the day. People are like, oh, that's why HR is doing that. We always want HR in the room too, because then we can have those conversations, but they're always there. All right, Chuck, what are your final thoughts?
My final thoughts is I'm hungry and I'm ready to go grocery shopping. But that's never a good time to go grocery shopping. My final thoughts, John, I really have nothing else to add other than what we just talked about, which is being consistent and following your policies and procedures and having those in place. And in fact, I'm excited to say, folks, if you want more of the team at HR Stories, we're going to have an opportunity for you to join us on a special program, a special journey where you can actually interact with us a little bit more. We have our HR Stories, our HR Ultimate Book of HR Checklists. Yeah. And don't forget the HR Team of One community on Facebook. If you've not joined, it is free. It is a great service. John, we're up almost 2,700 people. We're getting 30, 40, 50 people a week joining. It is an interactive community, and we are answering, and not just we, but the HR participants in that forum answer questions for each other each week, similar to the story we got today. So you don't end up like Whole Foods.
Right. Yeah. I mean, Whole Foods won, but they had to deal with it. And it all really, to me, it goes back to the inconsistency of enforcing that policy, before spring of 2020, right? If they had been doing that and it had been in policy and everyone knew and there was no things, I don't think that individual might not have come forward and wanted to wear that mask, right? And so again, I think it's important. Consistency, documentation. We say it all the time. Really important. And if you need help, please reach out to us at info@hrstoriesteam.com.
Yeah. Folks, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe. And once again, you've been listening to the HR Stories podcast, where there's a lesson in every story. See you next week.
Thank you for listening to the HR Stories podcast. The material presented in this podcast is for informational purposes only. Chuck and John always recommend using an employment lawyer or HR consultant to handle any legal concerns or HR issues. We do our best to double check sources and make sure the information we are providing is accurate. We may eliminate or embellish without changing the basic narrative to make the story easier to understand. In certain circumstances, we may change identifying information to protect the innocent. The HR Stories broadcast is brought to you by the team at HR Stories. The team at HR Stories is designed to help anyone with HR responsibilities be better at managing the employee experience. To engage with us, go to the hrstoriesteam.com and learn more about how the team at HR Stories can support your business or nonprofit. Thank you for listening to the HR Stories podcast, where there is a lesson in every story.